Kristen and Nick, would you just say a few words about yourselves as well?
Sure. Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us. My name is Kristen Schillig, and I work for Fulton County Superior Court. And I manage, I guess what I would say, our justice and mental health crossover work. So that includes lots of different projects, and one being this Familiar Faces project. So I'm going to get into, so I manage a lot of the reform work around justice and mental health initiatives. And we're going to talk a little bit about like the global reform and how Familiar Faces fits into that. And then Nick Hagney, we're a small team. There's only two of us, so you're looking at it. Nick's my other half, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Nick Hagney. I am a policy analyst and statistician, funded under this Familiar Faces project, but working with our Justice and Mental Health Task Force more broadly with all of our like data related work. And yeah.
All right, so Emily Ann, are you going to do this, share the slides, or you want me to do that, or what do we think?
I can do that. I just
okay.
pulled them up.
And then, can you remind me how much time we have? Because we can talk a lot or talk a little. I forget what
we have an hour. The last 15 minutes we try to leave for Q&A.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so I want to go over a brief history of our sort of mental health and criminal justice reform work that we've been doing in Fulton County. So in May of 2016, there was a call to action, which was championed by one of our county commissioners, Joan Garner. And our county sort of wholeheartedly embraced the Stepping Up Initiative, which is the national initiative to reduce the number of people with mental illness in jail. So that was kind of, how we got started. I guess how many years ago is that now? 6 years. So we've been doing this a while. So we knew in a county like Fulton County, obviously we're big, we're complicated, and lots of players, that we were going to need some technical support in order to pull off this work. So our Superior Court applied for and was awarded a planning grant through the Bureau of Justice Assistance to basically do some end-to-end analysis of our criminal justice system and the behavioral health systems, and specifically how a person with mental illness interacts with the justice system, like at every point along the way. So from first encounter to booking in jail to, how they're treated in jail to reentry and communities, and kind of back again. So we did this like full-on systems mapping, and actually I can drop in the link. We have a website, it's Fulton Steps Up. And so if you're interested in reading any of our reports or looking at any of our mapping and things like that, there's lots and lots of reports and information if you're interested. So I'll drop that. Maybe Nick, can you do that while I'm talking? It's just Fulton Steps Up. Anyway, and so the result of this is we prioritized some recommendations and kind of did this final report. We prioritized 4 of our recommendations and created business cases around them. So just lots of work, community planning. It was lots of moving parts, but it gave us a really good blueprint to work from. So how we sort of carried out the recommendations was through these sort of implementation teams. So we have one specific to like data, our screening reentry teams. We have one around housing. We have our Familiar Faces, and then we have a court collaboration group that sort of takes these recommendations and figures out how we're going to get that done. And then one thing that we're very proud of is we have been designated a Stepping Up Innovator County because of our good work around data, which we are really proud of. And we'll get to some of those details in a little bit. Next slide. Okay, so today we are here to talk about Familiar Faces. And so why are we focusing on Familiar Faces? So we know that there's a small group of people with very complex needs who are interacting with lots of different systems, and the services just are not meeting the needs, and the cycle just repeats kind of over and over again. We knew we needed a more holistic approach. And obviously, we have some volume issues in Fulton specifically, but we know also that there's a high cost in both the human cost and just the money, right? It just costs lots of money for folks to be kind of going from hospitals to jails to homeless shelters and then back again. And, one of the, other high level issues is that our systems just really don't, talk and interact very well. And even like with the siloed data systems. And so that's something we've been working towards. So it just makes it really difficult, and why we wanted to really focus on, our familiar faces or friendly faces, or some folks call it like high utilizers, which it's all the same. Next slide. So with the Familiar Faces project, we applied again for another Bureau of Justice Assistance grant. So that's actually what Nick and I are funded under right now. It's a 3-year grant. And this is kind of how the project timeline has broken down. And of course, we've had some delays with COVID, but I think generally speaking, we've, met our goals despite all the COVID challenges. But so the first year we spent a lot of time doing data analysis, just acquiring the data, and Nick's going to get much more into like how the data works. So I'm just going to give you a very high level, acquiring, doing some data matching, and we identified a pilot cohort of individuals, which we call our 100, and starting to apply some cost around that information. We started convening meetings in 2021 with our core partner groups. And I also want to mention that Grady Hospital is our formal partner on this project. So they've been working with our folks like when they're in the jail and connecting them to ACT teams and things like that. So just kind of building up those partnerships, building out a process model, like what does this look like? And Nick will talk about that as well. Developing some criteria, getting some MOUs, and just kind of formalizing what this looks like. And then this year we've spent a lot of time, and I say this has been a lot of Nick's work in just doing this integrated data platform. And then some shared responsibility around the familiar faces, so the actual people. Honestly, like Nick and I, we're not social workers, so we're not the people to work directly with the group of people that we're trying to help. So it's required us to really sort of build collaboration and getting our partners to sort of take on additional responsibilities when right now there is no funding to do that. But we're just kind of trying to prove, it's a proof of concept really at this point. So we've had just people are lining up and providers are lining up to support the project, because I think everybody realizes we got to do something different. So that's kind of where we are right now. Again, collaboration is key. That's what kind of makes this all work. Next slide. So I just wanted to also highlight, there's a brand new project called States Supporting Familiar Faces, and it's supported through the Council for State Government's Justice Center, the National Association of Counties, and Arnold Ventures. And so basically Georgia was one of 2 states selected for this project. And let's see, I'm going to read my notes because it's very specific. So this is part of the Mental Health Courts and Corrections Subcommittee of the State of Georgia Behavioral Health Reform and Innovation Commission. And so they've formed this Familiar Faces Advisory Committee, which is chaired by Justice Boggs. And the committee was established through HB 1013. And basically, we're going to be engaging in this like statewide initiative to basically position Georgia to enact policy changes. And they're going to do that through like using data to identify and serve, promote the use of pre-arrest diversion, and then building and scaling community-based behavioral health services, crisis care, and housing. And I listed on the right here the 8 or 9 counties that are participating. So I don't know if any of the folks in the call today see their counties represented, but this is the group of folks. There's some local leaders from each of these counties that are convening on a pretty regular basis to provide insight to the advisory committee. So I'm excited about this because they are really, it feels like taking lessons learned from the local jurisdictions to really influence the state policy around familiar faces. So we have our first meeting today. So this, I just kind of can really only share a high level of this, but just wanted to flag this if there's anybody on the call whose county you see represented. And if you're interested in engaging in familiar faces work, we always need new partners. So,
Kristen, I have a quick question.
sure.
For the counties that aren't listed, will there continue to be growth statewide as the committee moves forward?
I think so. I mean, I could definitely like hopefully answer that question, you know, the more we dig into it. But I mean, I think, yes, I think this is just sort of a starting point. And we know every county is a little different. So yeah, I mean, I think there'll be information that'll be disseminated, ways to engage, I'm sure, hopefully in the near future. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but
It does. Thank you.
okay. And I'm happy to send along information as I receive it and as I know, if you want to pass it around to your group, I'm happy to do that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to pass this over to Nick.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to run through our initial data analyses and how we identified our pilot cohort of familiar faces, as well as some of the data analyses that we've done around them. So when we first started, our initial primary source data was from Fulton County Jail. We got a 3-year data extract from 2017 to 2019. And then later on received a data extract from Atlanta City Detention Center covering the same time period. And from that, well, those data extracts represented all bookings and releases and all jail episodes at each facility. We reorganized it from a charge-based file to an episode-based file, and we engaged with county IT and jail staff to do some validity checks to ensure that, you know, this data was accurate and represented the populations that we were studying over these 3 years. And so we used these jail extracts to identify a group of 100 people. They represented about 0.1% of individuals arrested at each jail facility over the time period. But their frequency of arrest was far like outnumbered their small volume. And so once we identified our pilot cohort of 100 people, we cross-referenced them with a bunch of local organizations and agencies. And you can see that cross-referencing on the right side of this slide. So, I mean, one of the biggest things for us was that 80% of these people had an entry in the homeless management information system, indicating that 80% of them were at the very least housing insecure. And realistically, we know a large number of those people are actually chronically homeless. There was lots of crossover at Grady Hospital, typically for psychiatric issues as well as substance abuse issues. Atlanta Police Department had arrest, and I'll get into the Atlanta Police Department data in a few slides, but they were encountering these people constantly, continuously arresting them for low-level offenses. They were involved in competency at the jail, and distressingly, only 3 of our initially identified 100 people had any linkage to our or policing alternatives and diversion initiative, because realistically we see these familiar faces as being perfect candidates for diversion, and see the repetitive jailings as very detrimental to their well-being. Next slide, please. So in addition to just identifying based on the jail data, we wanted to drill down into the actual charges. So at Fulton County Jail, this represents a little over 50% of all bookings. We found that criminal trespass, possession and use of drugs, which you can see in those first 2 rows, and then as well as the last 2 rows, you know, those charges alone and in conjunction with each other made up about a third, or made up over a third of bookings at Fulton County Jail over 3 years. But also, you know, theft by shoplifting is there. Pedestrian offenses are very common, as well as obstruction of law enforcement. Next slide. And then at ACDC, Atlanta City Detention Center, we see the same sort of pattern. I was able to match 82 of our 100 to ACDC booking records based on a probabilistic matching algorithm. And so ACDC, that's the city jail. It's used typically for, I mean, the majority of inmates there are there on a driving offense or on some kind of low-level city ordinance violation, which you can see right here. So I matched 82 of our 100. They accounted for 855 bookings at ACDC, and over 70% of their charges fell into these categories. So quality of life, which is a broad category encompassing drunk in publics, disorderly conducts, pedestrian offenses like indecencies, those kind of things. And then, you know, you could see the shoplifting, the drugs. And then I also created a combination category to kind of further capture offenses that included multiple charges, but that all fell within these categories. And so broadly, like the charges listed here and on the previous slide, we use to inform what we're calling our crimes of interest. So those are offenses that are very often, but not always, associated with a mental health issue, a substance abuse issue, or homelessness. And so we wanted to, you know, we wanted to characterize the familiar faces population, but we also wanted, you know, baseline information and more general information about the full jail population at both facilities. And I'll touch on that a little bit later too. Next slide. And so this is, the next couple slides are about our data match with Elena Police Department. So we provided the names and date of births and demographic information for our cohort of 100 to Atlanta Police Department, who conducted a determinate match based on name and date of birth, and they were able to match 87 of our folks. This represents 12 years of data from 2009 to 2020. And those 87 individuals accounted for over 3,600 contacts with Atlanta Police Department officers, and 95% of those contacts were either a field interaction or an arrest. You know, that's a massive amount of interactions with police, and that only represents Atlanta Police Department. We have other law enforcement agencies operating in Atlanta and in Fulton County. So in reality, the interactions with law enforcement are even higher than is displayed here. Next slide. So 87 people with over 3,600 agency contacts. They averaged 41 apiece, and half of them had over 30 officer encounters. One person had 217 individual officer encounters. And then you can see kind of like a bucketing of those contacts. 21 of those 87 people had between 1 and 10, and so on. Just further reinforcing, you know, these are familiar faces and they're familiar to all of our law enforcement, but also behavioral health, local and community health organizations. Next slide. This is quantifying the number of years that these individuals had contacts with APD. So 50% amassed at least one contact with an APD officer over 7 different years. And most of those contacts occurred between 2017 and 2019. 40% of all of those contacts, which to me reinforces the kind of intuitive conclusion that these people, these familiar faces, are decompensating over time, and as their issues remain untreated and unmet, that they are continuously leading to worse and worse outcomes, which is really driving that churn at our jail facilities. Next slide. This is just basically a mapping of where this happens by Atlanta Police Department zones. Zone 5 is downtown Atlanta, and kind of just this tells us what we already knew, which is that this problem is mostly in downtown. I mean, we see these people every single day in distress. But this kind of further gives us evidence of that and allows us to, inform APD that, hey, this is where you're going to be encountering these people, as we develop protocols and just like a better way of doing things. Like, your zone 5 officers should be the ones on alert. This is where you should expect to encounter familiar faces. Next slide. And so just kind of a broad overview of all of that information, 69% of those encounters led to arrest, but there was also lots of suspicious person reporting, criminal trespass warning. And, again, distressingly, APD only referred one of our familiar faces to our policing alternatives and diversion program within, pre-2020. Next slide. So in addition to that, I wanted to do some analysis on like the back end of the actual cases and charges associated with our familiar faces. So this is Fulton County data only. This includes Superior, State Court, and Magistrate Court. It does not include Municipal Court, which handles the Atlanta city ordinance violations. But our familiar faces had 801 cases and 1271 charges disposed of within that 3-year period, 2017 to 2019. 31% were just simply dismissed, dead docketed, declined to prosecute. 60% did result in a guilty verdict, but nearly 3/4 of those guilty verdicts did not result in any kind of confinement. And 63% of those guilty verdicts did result in probation or a time served or suspended sentence. And probation especially is like a big area of concern for us, and something that we're attempting now to do a more like robust analysis around. Something that we see fairly often is someone gets busted on their 3rd or 4th or 5th like trespass or drug charge. They get assigned probation, but due to their health issues, whether it's mental health or substance abuse, or just the fact that they don't have a home, they aren't capable of complying with the conditions set forth by probation, which means that it's only a matter of time before they violate and a warrant's issued for them. And then they're right back in jail on what was originally a trespass charge, just because they didn't pick up the phone or they missed a meeting with their probation officer. Oftentimes there's not even a new offense associated with them being brought back to jail. Next slide. And so some of the key takeaways from our pilot cohort of familiar faces, these 100 people were booked 2,001 times in 3 years at 2 jail facilities. They spent nearly 39,000 days in jail. They averaged 20 days in jail per booking. They made up 0.1% of individuals at each jail facility, but accounted for 1.5% of all bookings. And those dollar amounts represent the average jail bed day cost at each facility, and how many days they spent in those facilities. On the right, I also wanted to just look at are crimes of interest more broadly at the full jail at both facilities. At Fulton County Jail, those trespasses, the drugs, the shoplifts, the quality of life offenses, those made up 8 to 10% of annual bookings. And at ACDC, they made up 30 to 35% of annual bookings. And you can see the dollars associated with just jailing those people. But some of the broad takeaways: familiar faces are booked in 10 times more frequently than the average person. They use 20 times the number of bed days. Women are overrepresented by 3 times in this population compared to the average jail population, and there is significant racial disproportionality. Next slide. So, this, everything I was just talking about represented our initial stages of analysis, and us just learning everything that we could about this population of people. So now, we've been implementing a more like a set process and a coordinated care collaboration process around actually better serving this group of people. So, the first stage of that is always identification. And to that end, we have implemented flags in the data systems of everything you see here on the left. I created the flags myself in our Fulton County data and Odyssey, which is our data management system. But we had all these other agencies create flags in their own systems. So before Atlanta police arrest somebody and take them to jail, they will be able to check and see hey, so-and-so is a familiar face. If possible, we should be diverting this person. And if one of our folks turns up at Grady in a mental health crisis or for drug treatment or something like that, Grady will know, and since they're our partner, they'll inform us immediately. So that's the flagging. On the care collaboration side, Kristen mentioned earlier, we've been convening these meetings. We have these bi-weekly reentry meetings where we discuss and staff cases to ensure that the proper representation is there for this person's court date, but that appropriate service providers are ready to take an individual in upon release from jail. We use Slack to do a lot of our communication. We have a HIPAA compliant version of Slack. So all of our main partners have accounts, and we use that to just kind of better communicate in between when we convene our meetings. We've also built some data dashboards that allow us, to take a live look at the jail. It allows us to do kind of our stepping up aggregated measurements, and as well as drill down on individuals to say that, hey, this is someone who needs care or needs a reentry plan. It allows us to do retrospective analyses, and just generally report out on baseline data related to mental illness at the jail. And then we have this behavioral health lookup tool that we're in the process of building, which kind of represents the first stage of our data sharing, data integration work. So I'll discuss that in a few slides. Next slide, please. So this kind of represents the process map. Those at the top here, these are our entry points. People show up at the hospital, or familiar faces, they show up at the hospital, they show up at one of the jail facilities. They are at homeless shelters, and occasionally they'll be at PAD. And next year, we hope that they'll be showing up at the Diversion Center as well. And so this kind of shows like how the process should go. So initially, someone shows up at a homeless shelter, they show up at Grady, we want our partners to ensure that make sure that this is a familiar face, and then communicate to the group that, hey, so-and-so is here at the hospital, they are here using a shelter bed. PAD is the Policing Alternatives and Diversion program. So it's our pre-arrest diversion program. After identification, we want them conducting and updating like the screenings and assessments. And throughout this, we want consistent updates, and that's what Slack has been really good for, ensuring that kind of constant communication to the broader group. So as those needs assessments and everything are updated, as information about upcoming court dates and bonds and aftercare reentry plans are disseminated to the group, we want to ensure that each individual has an assigned care coordinator prior to discharge. This care coordinator should ensure that the appropriate referrals are made, and ideally will be ensuring that the cohort member is re-engaged once they're out in the community. Because one of the issues that we had prior to all of this work is that people would come to jail, they'd get stable because they would be finally like on their medication regularly, or but as soon as they got released, they would decompensate and then the whole process would start over again. So we want to ensure that, the people are being re-engaged in the community and getting the services that they need. Next slide. Oh.
Okay.
You want to take this, Kristen?
Yeah. So we just quickly wanted to go through some of the. Are you there? Are we good?
I'm good.
Okay. So just some of the challenges that we've, through the years, and what we've learned is, through this familiar faces work, is that, we're still seeing obviously low-level misdemeanor charges are still being booked and held in jail pretrial. There's lots of missed opportunities for PAD, which is a policing alternatives, like the pre-arrest diversions that do exist are not being fully utilized. Lots of our folks have warrants through probation and then just use failure to appear. So we kind of sort of these administrative issues are, sort of plaguing, I guess, our familiar faces. We have currently no 24/7 drop-off center for law enforcement, which I'm going to talk through our new project, which I think I'll get straight to after this, probably our new exciting resource. Lots of competency issues with the familiar faces cohort, just delays in orders, delays all over the place. It's hard getting hospital beds, especially with COVID. We're having lots of court case processing delays. So I think about 20 to 25% of our familiar faces are in jail at all times. And so we just, even though we work for Superior Court, we're still having really difficult time getting folks on the court dockets to get their case processed and get them exited into the community. Obviously, I'm not telling this group anything we don't know, but just sort of generally a lack of resources for this tiny group, lots of policy barriers, and just like sustainability of this work. So these are some that, so next slide, Emily, and next slide. Can you go to the next one? I'm not sure, should we just skip straight to the diversion center piece, or do you want Nick to do it real quick on the data? Emily Ann?
We can do it real quick on the data. I think some,
Okay.
at least
Okay.
one person I saw that joined recently, I think is gonna
Okay.
want to hear that.
Sure.
Okay, so go back to the previous slide, I guess, real quick.
Yeah, so Krista mentioned it earlier, but all of our systems and local agencies, they work in silos. I mean, there is some kind of direct communication, but there's no formal process for sharing data or information. And there's certainly no record of being kept of that kind of informal communication that occurs. And so that's something that we have kind of wanted to fix and bridge the gap on. Next slide. Our short-term solution, this is just a snapshot of one of our data dashboards related to stepping up. This represents a linkage between our jail management system and the results of our correctional mental health screen, which is the screening that is administered at booking for all, that is administered at booking. This allows us to drill down and do retrospective analyses, and also allows us to kind of track our familiar faces population within the Fulton County criminal justice system. Next slide. What we're working towards more broadly, or is really this kind of integrated shared data system that would capture certain information from some of our core partners. So those include Grady Health Systems, they include our pre-arrest diversion program, and we're targeting a statewide integration with Georgia HMIS. And so the initial concept is very basic, very rudimentary. Like, we're not going to be sharing electronic medical records. We're not going to be sharing diagnosis information. What we're calling it, or what I'm calling it, is our behavioral health phone book. So if let's say I show up at the jail or one of our other intercepts, someone will be able to, an approved user will be able to look me up and say, hey, Nick has an assertive community treatment team at Grady, and he also has been staying at this such and such homeless shelter for the past month. Let me reconnect with people at each of those organizations and ensure that we can get Nick back into treatment, back into that bed. And ideally, it is meant to ensure that people are not falling out of the programs and services that they need. Like I said, so this is a very basic tool, but the idea is that we'll be able to scale it up in the future. We'll be able to add more partners, and we'll be able to increase the amount of information that is allowed to share. And eventually, we would like to see this sort of become the basis for a case management system at the diversion center.
Is this all through the HMIS system that you're talking about, the documentation itself?
Sorry, say that again.
When you were referring to your behavioral health phone book and the data platform, is this all stuff that you've done through HMIS?
No. So Fulton County uses the Odyssey criminal justice management system, which is operated by Tyler Technologies. So we have leveraged the county's existing contract with Tyler to build out this tool. And so the way it'll be structured is it will pull information from the approved and connected systems. It will match and deduplicate and provide a lookup function for individuals who have consented to share their information within the tool that will include information from HMIS, from Grady, from PAD, but it will be fairly rudimentary information. It won't include things like an electronic health record. It'll be very basic to start out. I'm happy to answer any other questions. Otherwise, we can move to the next slide.
Okay, so I'm going to just talk you through quickly our new project. So, you know, for many years we have talked about in Atlanta, and I'm sure you all can relate to this, is that, you know, we've had no divert to what, meaning, you know, when law enforcement encounters a person on the street that, you know, maybe they don't necessarily want to take to jail, they don't necessarily want to take to the hospital, there's like nowhere else to go. There's no alternatives. And we know that, you know, in other places around the country, they've built these pre-charge law enforcement diversion centers. And we just wanted that, you know, here in Atlanta. So I'm going to just kind of walk you through that. Next slide, Emily Ann. So multiple initiatives have generated momentum around this alternative to jail for people experiencing behavioral health concerns and extreme poverty. So through our Fulton County Justice and Mental Health Task Force, there was the, if you're in the Atlanta area, there was the ACDC Reimagining Task Force to kind of look at the city jail and figure out like, what could we do differently? And just a couple other work groups over the past 5 or 6 years. And, you know, we all know like, where's our divert to what? So lots of consensus around that need. Next slide. So creating somewhere else to go advances city and county goals to reduce de facto use of jails as crisis centers. So you can see the numbers here, just lots and lots of people, 22,000 plus people detained at ACDC between 2017, oh, got a typo there, and 2020, you know, being, like Nick described earlier, being held for charges associated with homelessness, mental illness, substance abuse, 5,800 plus people detained at the Rice Street Jail between 2019. So anyways, people are screening positive for mental health concerns, and they're staying twice as long in jail. We know that through our data analysis. And then, you know, over 10,000 Fulton County bookings for low-level charges. So divertible charges, things that we know we can do something else with. So, and just lots and lots of volume. Next slide. So the city jail is in a strategic location in downtown Atlanta. You know, our last mayor, Mayor Bottoms, had put in place several criminal justice reforms, one around bail reform, and then the other was through the cancellation of the ICE contract. And really our jail population had gotten down to about maybe 30 people per day being in the jail. And there is bed space for about like 1,300 people. So it's really just a mostly empty building in a prime location in downtown Atlanta, and is a building that the city owned. So it's a strategic location. It's right by the MARTA station, if you're familiar with it, and very easy access for law enforcement. Next slide. All right, so Nick has done some analysis around, you know, how many people we feel like could be diverted to the diversion center. So if you can see here, we feel like there's a potential to divert, you know, over 10,000 jail bookings. And then another issue that we believe the center is addressing is admissions to Grady Hospital's emergency room and the psychiatric ER services. Grady is one of the co-located partners at our diversion center. So, you know, we feel like that partnership is going to address some of these police custody admissions as well. Next slide. So the goals of the center is we want to provide a service-based response to people with mental illness, substance use, chronic homelessness, and basically altogether avoiding the criminal justice system as a form of response. We want to reduce the number of people with mental illness and all these things entering our city and county jails. We want to offer a space where we can connect people to services. And that's why we're being very deliberate about the partners that we're going to have co-located in the center. We want to preserve law enforcement and medical resources. And then, you know, really this is just a first step here in Atlanta for building out a full continuum of care to really just, you know, stop using the criminal justice system as a place for services. Like we believe people should receive services in the community as much as possible. Next slide. So what is this diversion and services center? So again, law enforcement drop-off point offering co-located services. Some of these services include, one thing that we know is really important to law enforcement is having easy drop-off. A group of us recently went to Houston and Tucson to see their law enforcement drop-off centers. And the drop-off time is usually about 5 to 10 minutes. So they can, law enforcement, they encounter a person, they take them there, drop off 5 to 10 minutes, super fast, which is very different than an arrest, which can take, hours. We will be providing screening and needs assessment. There will be a sobering room, where folks can just go and sort of wash out and just kind of move along. I think it's important to mention too, that this is a non-custodial center. So folks are not under arrest. We will be using peers to really try to engage folks as they're there, but people can leave at any time. But our goal is to keep people there as long as possible. In the center, we'll provide housing assessments. We'll have some providers from the housing continuum available to do assessments and help with placement, obviously case management and legal aid. Our partnership with Grady will offer some just kind of like wound care and some non-emergency medical care. This is so the warrant resolution piece, like I mentioned before, lots of having any kind of warrant is actually a barrier to diversion under our current policy. So let's just say an officer encountered a person on the street, it's a divertible charge, it's a divertible situation. But if a person has a warrant, even if it's just on a trespassing warrant, which is, they can't be diverted. So we're working with the Georgia Justice Project to kind of help resolve these warrants so we can increase access to diversion. And then, one of the things, when I first heard about this concept, like, are we really going to do a diversion center in a jail? I mean, it was just like, what? But it actually makes a lot of sense because within the jail, there's already a commercial kitchen, there's laundry, all these things exist already in the jail. We're just sort of repurposing it. So, just lots of amenities that we can offer and that we envision. And it'll be sort of a living room model where, folks we're kind of building out the design to have like a comfortable feel as much as possible. Next slide. I guess, our milestones to date, if anybody here works in city and county government, you can appreciate this accomplishment where the city of Atlanta and Fulton County both agreed to this intergovernmental agreement to basically establish the center and fund the center. So the city of Atlanta is actually covering the renovation costs of the jail, but the city and county are both contributing $2.5 million every year in operating expenses and through this partnership. So it's just really exciting. I'm not gonna lie, it happened on my birthday and I cried that day because it was just so exciting to actually see this project that we've been dreaming of for many years and getting our leaders to agree. So it was a really, really big deal. So in December, the conceptual design was developed. January, we came to an agreement with the Department of Corrections, which is the jail basically. And then, how this diversion center is sort of operating is under sort of this umbrella of a Justice Policy Board, which we have co-chairs. One is an Atlanta City Council member, and then one is our Superior Court judge. And so we convene quarterly to just kind of talk about the operations, what the vision is, and just, kind of getting it all out there and making sure that we're moving forward with the project. And then obviously our new mayor is supportive, and that was done through legislation. And then we've been getting some funds. One was through the Microsoft Justice Reform Initiative. So they're sponsoring the architectural design work. Yeah, I think next slide. We might skip to just questions at this point. This is kind of what it looks like. Go back just one. So, as you can see here, we're just taking up a very small little spot at the jail, but it's, exciting. This is kind of what it looks like. And I think, I don't know, Emily Ann, is there anything specific you want me to continue to cover, or you want to go to questions?
Yeah, I think we probably have, I know I have a few questions, but I think there's probably some others as well.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I know I've heard this presentation so many times, and every time I hear it, I get more out of it, and makes me just inspired to do more. So I guess before I go down my quick list of questions, does anybody else have any questions to start with? Okay, then I will start with mine. I just had one with the slide about the drug arrests and then marijuana arrests. I'm just curious. So that's separated. I assume marijuana is a lesser charge. Is that accurate? Or
Yeah, and marijuana is more typically explicitly noted in charges than other drugs are. And also allows us to kind of extricate better like who might be in need of substance abuse services.
got it.
And also just marijuana, arrests for marijuana are a little bit more broad. There's like a larger population, I guess, of people who will pick up a marijuana charge compared to the more serious drugs.
Got it. And then I had another question about, with only one referral, do you hypothesize that's because the education is not there, or because the referral is more work for the officers, or they just don't know what they don't know?
Probably a combination of all of that, really. I mean, it's all Kristen, when did PAD expand?
So they expanded citywide last year. I mean, I will say that PAD does a lot of training with law enforcement. It's really just a culture shift, and we know it's going to take time. You know, the way that I see PAD is, you know, they do the best they can with the resources that they have, but they don't really have, like, the diversion center is going to fix a lot of like the low referrals, I think, because of the co-located partners. You know, PAD, and the way that it's kind of like a mechanism, right? It's like, you know, law enforcement encounters somebody, they're divertible, PAD responds to the scene, and they can do something different. I will say, like, a lot of officers feel like, you know, folks will go to PAD and then they just kind of walk out the door, and they're wanting to see like more teeth in it, even though, you know, we know, especially with familiar faces, like the teeth part is really not making a difference either. So I think it's just, again, like, it's going to be a culture change. I think the diversion center will help increase diversions. You know, PAD works aggressively with APD and and MARTA police to, you know, increase referrals and problem solve. And I think it's actually gotten better. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's a very complicated issue, I'll say.
It does. Thank you. And then I had another, I wanted to ask, Slack, that's a platform. What is that? Can you explain what that is?
Sorry, I didn't explain that in more detail. It's really just like a messaging software. It kind of, I mean, if you remember like AOL Instant Messenger, it's like sort of similar in structure, but like for us, the way we use it is each of our familiar faces has their own separate channel, of which our approved users can access. So if person A gets arrested, you know, I'll send a message and say, hey, everyone, person A got arrested yesterday for criminal trespassing and possession and use of drugs. And then that will let like the public defender social worker's office know that this person is in jail. So then they can go and communicate with that person and figure out all of what needs to be done. But Slack, it's essentially just a messaging software that is like safe and secure. We have the HIPAA compliant version of it. And it makes it so that there aren't a million email chains going around. regarding a couple of our familiar faces.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, that was all my questions. I appreciate it. Does anybody else have any questions? All right, so we have recorded this conversation, so we'll be sharing that with our other partners. And I know I got some asks on the chat for more information after today. So I'll share your information, and there might be some additional conversations that hopefully come from this, and we're grateful for all the work that you're doing.
Thanks so much for having us. And do you want to include, thank you, our email addresses?
Yeah,
in the
I will.
communica-
That's okay.
Sure.
And then the PDF of the presentation.